Guess we'll get started. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the launch of Finding Your Way into Early Adulthood, an audiobook by teacher, psychologist, and author Helen MIddleton, containing some much-needed life perspectives for those faced with the intrepid adventure of trying to puzzle out a direction for their lives. I'm zooming in from Bidjigal land of the Darug Nation and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, coming into adulthood is a tumultuous period in anyone's life, and where you are finally handed the reins of primary decision maker, primary responsibility for your own mistakes, and none of the knowledge of where to go. So even for those types who can plan long term, no plan survives contact with the enemy, or in this case, the changing circumstances of everyday life. And it can be a blessing to have some wisdom to fall back on. So to find exactly that kind of wisdom, you can purchase a copy of Finding Your Way in Early Adulthood from Authors Direct, Audible, and or Google Play. So links will be in the comments, the event launch page, and on the Mini Digi Facebook page as well for those. So join us now for a Q&A with Helen, where we explore in detail her past with helplines, teaching, youth counselling, parenting, psychology, and more. That has culminated in her writing the valuable lessons that she learned and imparts into a compact crystallized essence. This is an audiobook for all situations, both for when to listen to it and also the wisdom it contains. So come find out some of what made it happen. But before we start, I'd just like to make a quick disclaimer or public service announcement. So if you need help, someone to talk to, or are concerned about someone you know, then please reach out to a helpline for assistance. If you think there may be a medical emergency, then please contact 000 immediately. You or anyone you are concerned about are encouraged to seek professional advice and treatment from qualified practitioners and providers. So there will be links to some helplines in the comments. Thank you, Hannah, for putting those up. So we'll start with the questions. So Helen, can you tell us a bit of a timeline about your work with young people, particularly as a teacher and guidance counsellor?
Okay, well, I think even as a young adult, I was involved in a lot of youth leadership programs and so on. And then I went into TAFE teaching originally and worked in an alternative school in Melbourne. And when I was then I moved to Brisbane and worked in high schools up there. When I was about 40, I was given a scholarship to study school counselling. So I worked as a guidance officer up there for 13, 14 years. Moved to Hobart in 2006 and worked in the employee assistance, but also worked at Headspace and in private practice. And currently I'm still doing telehealth Australia-wide with an organisation, and I'm still working with adolescents. So pretty much a whole lifetime, a long one too.
Yeah, sounds like you're keeping busy. So what are some of your favourite tips for young people from the book?
Okay, just a few. Look, I think growing up, we're all taught to not think about what we want, that it's really selfish to think about what you want, and you should put other people first and think about what they want. My suggestion is you park that to one side and that you really think seriously about what you do want for you. And that doesn't have to be self-centered. It could be that you want to take some flowers to the lady down the road who just lost her husband. It's a matter of being mindfully focused on where you're going and what you want out of your life and what you want out of your relationships. Okay. Second one, I think if you're distressed about something, it's really important that you learn to go and talk to somebody that you trust. Because when you talk about the things that are stressing you or depressing you or distressing you, when you talk about things, they become more real, and so do the pathways through them become clearer. So I really encourage you to find someone you trust that you can talk through things with.
Yeah, it doesn't even need to be someone who talks back necessarily, does it? No. It's just even vocalizing it can help you see it clearer.
Yeah, the luxury about going to a trained counsellor is that you have the luxury that session is totally focused on you. You don't have to worry about the person you're talking to, looking after them or accommodating them. It's all about you, and it's a luxury to have somebody just focus on you. So yes, by all means, anybody you trust, or seek out a professional counsellor that has a good reputation. Okay. Maybe one more thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think the other tip is that I guess I've dealt with a lot of young adults who are really suffering from their first partner breakup. And I just want to say, look, your first love is most likely not your last. You may fall in love many times, and it's likely that you'll fall harder each time. It'll get harder each time until you find the person that is right for you, where it all is easy and comfortable. So relationships shouldn't require too much work, especially in the early stages. And when you break up with somebody, it's really important to acknowledge that there are many differences, and that's why you haven't been able to sustain the relationship. So when there's not a good meshing of all the myriad of things we bring into a relationship, when the meshing's not there, the relationship is just going to fail at some stage, and it's neither your fault nor their fault. Okay.
Yeah, I think something that I've sort of found that people could learn more about is that there's a release and a relief in a very clean breakup, because some of the people that are still sort of trapped in this like entanglement, they've broken up, but they haven't quite broken up, and they get back together and they break up again. Yeah, it just seems it's not good for you. And I guess that's where your point about knowing what you want is very important, because you want to be healthy, obviously, and that kind of relationship is very toxic, and having a yardstick to sort of measure against would be very helpful.
Well, there's power in knowing what you want. Okay, there's power and strength in that. And please, if you're going to break up with somebody for all the good reasons, no texting, no emailing. At least have the guts to go and talk it through and say, look, this is just not what I want. This is not what's good for me. You know, whatever. Okay.
Yeah. Now I feel called out, because like one time I had I didn't break up over text.
Oh, good.
I broke up over the phone because there was no way to like physically reach out and make contact, I guess. Yeah. Okay. So was this a book you wrote over a long period of time, or was it written in sort of one solid writing block?
Look, I think when I was school counselling in high schools in Brisbane, I think I jotted some bits and pieces down. So there was obviously a long intention there to maybe write some of this. When I worked down at Headspace in Hobart for a while, I remember jotting down scenarios. But I think as my oldest grandson was sort of getting close to teenage years, I thought, I've got to get this book written, you know, because there are two books, Teen Time and this one, and I've got to get the first one written for him before he gets to teenage years. So I think I settled down and got them written within 2 or 3 years. So yeah.
So I know this is also available as like a paperback or a Kindle. Did you have to change anything, like rewriting it for audiobook?
No, not at all. No, not at all.
That's good. Yeah, because I feel sometimes you sort of have to translate it to a more spoken thing, but when it's this sort of
I think the content and the themes are pretty timeless, really. So yeah.
So what was the motivation to begin consolidating all your notes and experiences into a book?
Well, I was working in school when I first started thinking about it. I was in school counselling, and I thought, oh gosh, and I looked at the filing cabinets. I thought, I have counselled thousands, literally thousands of young people. And then I looked around and looked at I think there were 2006, there were 7 grandchildren under the age of 6 or something like that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be around when they're young adults. Who's going to help them? Who's going to be counselling them? And yet I've given this to all these, you know, thousands of other young people. I want something for my grandchildren. So that's when I sat down and thought, okay, I'm going to put as much as I can down as possible into something that they can read if they want to in due course.
Yeah, and then there's the benefit that now other people can also.
That's right. That came
benefit
later
from that. Yeah,
a few people read it and said, "Hey, come on, you should publish this more widely than not just for your grandchildren." So,
well, I'm glad you listened to them. So what made you want to record it as an audiobook after you'd already written it as a paperback?
Well, there'd been quite a bit of feedback on the first book. The second book, I found a few parents were buying it and so on, but really by the time you're 17, your parents have stopped buying books for you, and you don't have the money because you're studying or working or saving for a house or whatever. As a young adult, it's not easy to go out spending money on books. So I thought, the audio book is something that we'll get to a different kind of audience, and it will be a lot cheaper and a lot easier, so that people can listen to it while they're going to the gym or walking or whatever, and they might listen to bits of it, and that's fine. That's what it's designed for. Yeah,
it might be a good motivational tool for getting yourself to the gym as well. You need to be in shape. So do you think that young people should be free to make their own mistakes? And are you a believer in either side of the nature versus nurture debate?
look, absolutely, people have to follow their own journey and make their own mistakes. We all do. That's life. And at the same time, I think when I wrote the books, I didn't write them to be telling people what to do or how to lead their life or what they should do. What I wanted to do was give them a much broader sort of background perspective on the way of looking at different sort of problems that come along. So sort of going a little bit deeper into the underlying, values and things. And we're always with the theme of, well, what is it that you want? If you're thinking about relationships and you're thinking, is this the right one for the right person for me? How do you go about assessing and coming to that position yourself where you know what you want? The books are written in a way that, you could read little bits of them or big bits of them. It's totally up to you. I mean, some kids seem to have innate wisdom about life and what they're doing and incredible emotional intelligence and so on, and others don't. And I guess the theme of knowing what you want and choosing how to be is really about taking a considered approach rather than just reacting to life, to actually take life into your own hands and mold it the way you want it to be. As far as the nature nurture stuff, look, when I look at grandkids and all the generations around me and so on, clearly there are some personality features that are passed on. But I also think, things like depression, people often say, oh, well, my mother was depressed, my grandmother's depressed, so therefore I've got it too. And it's like, no, what you've learned is copied from them, or you learned from them a certain way of dealing with the world that leads to depression. And that means you can change it. You don't have to do the same. You can do differently. So clearly, nature and nurture both play a very big part.
Yeah. So this is more about like giving people a sort of skill set or like a framework. Because I remember my favorite teacher at school. He taught history, modern history, and his attitude was very sort of upfront. And he was like, "My job is not to teach you history; it's to get you an HSC. But I'm going to teach you like sort of the more valuable skills of how to think critically."
Yeah.
Which is sort of also, I find like that's really what you take away most of the time from a university degree or something like that.
The most
is like,
important part, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's not
you're being taught how to think properly,
absolutely.
not just the knowledge itself.
Yeah.
So sort of nature and nurture carrying on. Have you heard of failure to launch? And do you have any thoughts about it?
Absolutely. Look, I couldn't tell you the number of distressed mums and dads who phoned and said, I don't get it. My son or my daughter has done really, really well at school and there's never been any problems, and now they're just at home. They're not doing anything. They're not engaging with life at all. They're not making that next jump into adulthood. And, often sometimes it's the really, really bright kids, your top performers who've never thought about what they actually want to do when they leave school. They're too busy getting the top marks or going through school, and then suddenly find they're lost. Okay. So it's a very typical problem, sadly. And there are a lot of young adults who are really stuck and really just don't know where to go or what to do or how to get themselves out of the funk that they've got themselves into at the end of year 12, because they've relied so much on school to tell them what to do and how to do it. Okay. So, yeah, failure to launch is a big one, and it's very complex. It's not just one thing that holds somebody back. Often it's a whole a lot of contributing features that put somebody in the position they're in. So I've had good feedback from people who's, you know, looked at the book and their young adult has latched onto something that has meaning for them and has given them a bit of a way to go.
Yeah, like I'm not sure I would be able to claim anything like I was a brilliant child at school and now I'm not going anywhere, but I did have a period where I wasn't going anywhere, and had like chronic fatigue that sort of ground my life to a halt. And I think one of the most comforting things that sort of helped me lift me up a bit was that I did know that I wasn't the only person not going anywhere, and most people, in fact, sort of struggle to figure out where they're going. And you don't have to know where you're going. You
Absolutely.
just, as long as you're going in a good direction.
Right. It comes back to choosing goals, and choosing to make some goals. You've got to kind of have an idea of what you want. And it's a bit like if you go and the first time you go driving your own car on your own, if you go and sit in the car and you've got no direction, well, you're not going to go anywhere. You're just going to sit in the car. You've got to have direction where you move from one thing to the other, and maybe change many times, but it's the direction and the goal that's important.
Yeah. Oh, it's almost like everything in your book's linked and it all circles back.
Yep.
Yeah, because I think that sort of also comes back to the, do you think people should be free to make, or young people should be free to make their own mistakes? I think part of that is that you're not really free from a young age to make your own mistakes until you're an adult and no one's holding your hand anymore. It's very much like school and your parents are sort of telling you what to do, when to do it. And yeah, maybe a bit of independence at an earlier age where your mistakes aren't very costly, is something that people could benefit from. But yeah, that's a whole other debate. That's
it is, you know,
and all that. Yeah.
You get older, the mistakes get more serious and the repercussions are more serious. So parents, you know, step in.
So, okay. So as like, whenever I've received good advice, I can acknowledge that it's good advice, and I'm like, wow, that'll be really helpful to know. But sometimes it's quite hard to actually apply. So did you have any ideas on how to apply advice, like what to do in the moment?
Yeah, look, I wouldn't expect anybody to read the book from cover to cover, although parents often do, okay? But the young people that they're written for, we know that young adults will focus on what they want, what they need. They know what they need and they'll go after it. So I wouldn't expect them to read the book from cover to cover, but look, if they've just lost somebody, I would think, might be a good idea to read that chapter on grief. Or if they're dating somebody who's got children, it might be a good idea to read the chapter on step parenting. Or, you know, if they're worried about whether this one's the right relationship for them, well, maybe a good idea to read the chapter on relationships. So in a way, it's there for when they want it, when it is relevant to them, because nobody wants to read stuff that's not relevant.
Yeah. Well, that's good that there's like sections that you can go to for sort of specific help. So with the specific advice, not advice, wisdom and all that in the book, a lot of it seems to be centered very much in Gestalt therapy. And so what is Gestalt therapy for those who are unfamiliar with it?
Okay, well, I guess when I was writing these books, I brought together, you know, many years of training in different therapy modes, etc., etc. Okay, so I tried to put it into everyday language rather than use theoretical terms and so. So Gestalt therapy is one of the modalities that I trained in, and it's just another way of doing therapy, but it really focuses on the here and now. In other words, you don't have to go back and go through all early dramas and traumas and things like that if you don't want to. You can focus on, well, what's the issue now? what is it that you want to change about the issue, and how might you experiment and find creative ways to bring about what you want. So it's how do you move on from where you are at the moment, okay, in a future oriented direction. So it's the here and now stuff is very similar to mindfulness, which is bandied around a lot these days. Most people know what mindfulness is. So
So why did something about Gestalt therapy grab you when you were studying, or like, because typical psychology or psychology studies seem to be very focused on past trauma as a stereotype.
CBT approaches, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So was there like something about it that grabbed you, or did someone introduce it to you?
I was introduced to it in my training year as a guidance officer. I had a week long workshop in it, and I was fascinated by the way it seemed to give an emotional roadmap. In other words, to understand, you know, finished business, unfinished business, emotional, how we move through things, and to what the progression is. So I found that quite fascinating, because it was nothing, I had not come across it like anything else, and it's like suddenly all this emotional self made sense. So yeah, I guess it. I followed up with family therapy, which gave me another kind of understanding of how systems and families all work together. So between the two, they were my strong theoretical backgrounds, I guess.
So you mentioned mindfulness and how it's quite like popular now, I guess, is a word you could use to describe it. So like, how does it help you stay on top of things?
Okay, well, mindfulness takes you back to your basic senses. Now, the only data that goes into our body is sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. So mindfulness, when it takes us to our senses, we have a sense of being in the here and now, in the moment. And that's the healthiest mental space you can ever be. When you're in a state of anxiety, you're anxiously ruminating, going over things in the past or things about the future, or the fantasy interchange between the two, but you're not in the moment. You're not in the here and now. So mindfulness is about learning how to do things, and how, in a way that you stay in the here and now and give yourself permission to stay in the presence. And Gestalt then takes it a bit further on as to, well, okay, that's where you are. Where do you want to be in the future? What's next? What do you want? Okay. So they're closely linked, but quite different. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, Gestalt therapy seems a bit like it sort of underpins most forms of therapy in a way.
It does. It's a very old, yeah.
The only sort of direct reference to maybe a technique that it uses or something that I've encountered, and sorry for anyone who can hear my dog in the background. He's very excited about bins being moved around. So yeah, the only technique that I've encountered, I think, was turning your goal into a mountain, and then you sort of, or like you take your goal as a mountain, and then you sort of break down how you're going to make it to the top of the mountain. And so it could be, well, in 5 or 10 years, I want to be a very successful lawyer or something like that. Okay, you break down the steps. What do you need to do? Or you can work backwards and you can say, well, you need to be a lawyer in the first place. That involves going to law school. You need to study hard to get the marks to go to law school. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. But yeah, that if for something so like sort of central to
it's about looking at barriers. And so what are the barriers? Once you know what you want, you know, then what's the barriers, and how do you overcome them, and how do you experiment with ways to overcome them that don't cause you too much distress?
Yeah, okay, that's a much better way of putting it than what I was attempting to go for. Yeah, so speaking of barriers, what are some of the biggest barriers to entry in young people seeking advice that they need or guidance? And what are some of the ways to overcome those barriers?
I think it's largely access. Services are overrun at the moment, and with bushfires and floods, and there's a waiting list, and that's a problem, because when you're in the depth of despair over something, you don't want to be waiting 6 or 8 weeks till you can get into somebody to see them about it. The situation passes and you miss a golden opportunity to work through some of the things that are important. So I think also at a time when young people are renting, saving to buy a house, getting their career on track, etc. There might be a few that earn a really high salary, but for a lot of young people, it's really hard yakka, and they don't have the money to pay the gap fees that are required. Medicare is quite generous in its allowance, especially with the COVID-10 that you get at the moment. You can have something like 20 sessions in the year funded by Medicare, but you can't afford, or young people can't afford, the gap that has got to be paid on top of that. So, yeah, I think access is the biggest problem. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think there are sort of schemes sounds quite sinister, but like plans and stuff set up that help cover the gap. They do seem pretty hard to sort of get yourself included on those, like with mental health plans and all that. Yeah.
They're limited too. They're limited to a number of sessions. Yes.
Yeah, and often you need a lot more sessions than what is offered.
Yeah.
So you've worked with telehealth and with youth counselling and teaching.
Yeah.
So are there some resources out there that young people probably aren't utilising as much as they should?
Yes, I mean, in terms of education, high schools, TAFE colleges, not so much training organisations, but universities all have counselling faculties, okay? Beyond Blue, Headspace, Lifeline, Black Dog Institute, Anglicare, Centrecare, you've just got to be resourceful and find the ones that are closest to you, and get in there and get your name down, and hopefully get some access as soon as possible. There's a lot of basic self-help information on the internet, which can be dangerous, if you start looking up and checking yourself against the symptoms there. Mr. Google can cause lots of erroneous diagnoses, etc. So I guess the books that I've written they don't provide that kind of detail, because that detail is all out there on the net, okay? What they do is they give a much wider picture and a sort of a behind the scenes way to navigate through whatever situation that comes along. So rather than a right or wrong, do it this way or do it that way, it's about, okay, so you're in this situation, what can you do to make it better for yourself? Yeah.
So it's much more providing help for the person to help themselves.
Yes.
And like put stuff in a framework that works for them.
Yeah.
Okay. So that pretty much wraps up the Q&A. So I just wanted to say thank you, Helen, for providing some of your hard-won insight from a career dedicated to helping young people, and just for a wonderful conversation. As someone with a vested interest in the mental health of young people, both like being one myself and also knowing some that could use a bit of support, I agree that there's not really that many resources out there that are easy to tap on, other than knowing a bunch of people older than you that you can sort of go and pick the brains of. So thank you for helping to fill that gap. I know I'll be pointing some of the parents and some of the young people that I know towards your book. So for more invaluable insight and perspectives on some of the more specific contexts in life as a youth, you can purchase a copy of Finding Your Way in Early Adulthood from Authors Direct, Audible, and Google Play. So the links, again, will be in the comments. They'll be on the Mini-Digi Facebook page and in the launch event page. So there are also Kindle and paperback versions available on Amazon that you can order. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and I hope you are staying safe. So be well and have a good night. Thanks.